Samuel had lived alone for as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember. He was a man of quiet habits, a solitary figure who preferred the company of trees, birds, and the gentle flow of the nearby river to that of people. The cabin he lived in was old, with weathered wood that had begun to crack in some places, and the roof showed signs of many winters weathering its way through. Yet to Samuel it was perfect. It was a place where he could be himself, where he could live on his own terms without anyone asking questions or telling him what to do. He had not always been alone. Long ago, the cabin had echoed with laughter, the chatter of friends, and even the occasional argument that ended with smiles. But those days were far behind him. Life, as it often does, had taken its own path. People he loved had moved on, and circumstances had left him with no choice but to embrace solitude. At first it had been painful. Samuel remembered the nights filled with silence so deep that even the sound of his own heartbeat seemed loud, but gradually he had grown used to it. He learned to find comfort in the simplicity of his daily life, and in the quiet he discovered a kind of peace. Every morning, Samuel woke before the sun. He would step outside his cabin, breathe in the crisp air, and watch as the first rays of light touched the tops of the tall pine trees. His day always started with small tasks, checking the traps he had set for rabbits, collecting firewood, and tending to his small garden, which had seen him through many seasons. Vegetables were simple, but they sustained him. He grew potatoes, carrots, onions, and sometimes tomatoes in the summer months. Each harvest reminded him that he could still take care of something, even if it was just himself. Samuel was not just surviving. He was thriving in his own way. He knew the forest like the back of his hand. Every path, every hidden stream, every berry bush was familiar. Birds would sing at dawn and dusk, and sometimes, if he was lucky, he would catch a glimpse of a deer moving silently through the underbrush. These small moments gave him joy. Nature had become his companion, and in the absence of human voices, he had learned to listen carefully to the whispers of the wind, the rustling of the leaves, and the distant call of animals. Despite his contentment, Samuel could not entirely escape memories. Sometimes as he sat by the fire in the evening, the shadows of the past would creep into his mind. He would remember his family, the laughter that once filled his home, and the friends who had come and gone. There were moments when the loneliness pressed heavily on him, moments when he wondered what it would be like to have someone share his cabin, even for a day. But these thoughts were fleeting. Samuel had built a life around independence, and he was determined to maintain it. His neighbors, a small town several miles away, often wondered about him. Occasionally someone would brave the rough path to visit, bringing news or supplies, but Samuel preferred these visits to be rare and brief. He did not dislike people. He simply had grown accustomed to silence and self-reliance. Townsfolk whispered stories about him. Some said he was a hermit, others said he was a wise man who understood the forest better than anyone else. Samuel paid little attention to these stories. He had long learned that the opinions of others mattered little when one was content with one's own life. The seasons came and went, each bringing its own rhythm to Samuel's days. Spring was a time of renewal. He would watch the first buds appear on the trees and listen to the cheerful songs of the birds returning after winter. Summer brought warmth, long days, and a sense of abundance in the forest. Samuel would fish in the river, swim occasionally, and take pleasure in the long golden evenings. Autumn painted the forest in fiery reds and golds. He would collect fallen leaves, prepare his store of firewood, and savor the crisp air. Winter, though harsh, had its own beauty. The snow would blanket the forest in white silence, and the cold nights would force him to sit closer to the fire, tending it carefully, finding comfort in its warmth. Samuel's solitude also allowed him to develop a kind of wisdom that only comes from long periods of reflection. He thought deeply about life, about the choices people make, and about the world around him. He observed the cycles of nature and understood the delicate balance that existed in the forest. He noticed how one small change in the environment could affect many living creatures, and he learned to live with respect for every element of his surroundings. This awareness gave him a sense of purpose even in isolation. Sometimes children from the town would wander into the forest, curious about the man who lived alone. Samuel did not mind their visits. He would watch from a distance as they played, often leaving small gifts like berries or pieces of bread for them to find. Though he rarely interacted with them directly, there was a quiet bond he felt with these young visitors. They reminded him of a life that once was, and perhaps a life that could be again if circumstances changed. As the years passed, Samuel developed routines that had become second nature. He would rise early, complete his tasks, sit by the river in the late afternoon, and finally return to his cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. Nights were quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. And yet Samuel never felt fear. He had learned to read the signs of the forest, to understand the subtle language of the wind and the stars. He felt a connection to the world that few others could understand, a sense of belonging that was independent of society or human company. Yet even in his contentment, there were hints that change was near. Occasionally he would notice smoke in the distance rising from places he did not recognize, or he would hear voices carried on the wind, faint and unfamiliar. At first he dismissed these signs as his imagination, the forest playing tricks on a man who had spent too many years alone. But deep down, he sensed that his life of complete solitude might soon be interrupted. Samuel could not have known that the coming days would challenge the boundaries of his isolated existence. He had lived alone for so long that even the thought of sharing his space with others seemed strange. And yet the forest, which had been his refuge, was about to bring visitors who would change his life in ways he could not yet imagine. On one particularly quiet evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel sat on his porch watching the forest settle into night. He sipped a cup of warm tea, the steam rising gently in the cool air. The peacefulness was familiar, comforting, and yet there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to happen. Samuel did not know what it was, but his intuition, honed by years of living close to nature, told him that his long years of solitude were nearing an end. In the stillness, Samuel felt a mix of emotions, curiosity, apprehension, and a subtle hope that perhaps the forest had more to offer him than just silence. He could not see the future, but he was beginning to sense that life had a way of surprising even those who believed they were beyond its reach. And so he sat quietly, watching the shadows deepen among the trees, unaware that the world he had known for decades was about to bring new voices, new stories, and new experiences to his old cabin. The storm had been building all day. Dark clouds rolled over the forest, and the wind whispered through the trees with a strange urgency. Samuel noticed the change in the weather, as he often did, but he did not feel alarmed. He had lived in the forest long enough to know how to prepare for storms. He checked his firewood supply, secured the windows, and made sure the cabin was safe. Yet as evening fell and the first raindrops began to fall, he felt an unusual sensation, a mix of anticipation and unease, as if something beyond the storm was coming. It was then that he heard the first voices. Faint at first, carried on the wind, they grew louder as they approached. Samuel stepped out onto his porch, peering through the rain, trying to see through the darkened forest. Shadows moved between the trees, and soon he saw figures, 15 people soaked by the rain, trudging through the mud and fallen leaves. They were a group of Apache travelers, tired and clearly in need of shelter. Their leader, a tall man with calm eyes and a kind face, stepped forward and called out, asking for a place to stay for the night. Samuel's first reaction was hesitation. He had lived alone for decades. The idea of 15 strangers entering his small cabin was overwhelming. He had enough food and supplies for himself, barely enough to see him through the winter. And yet, as he looked at their tired faces, he saw something familiar, the same weariness he had felt during his own struggles. He felt a pull toward kindness, a reminder of the values he had always held but had rarely needed to exercise in recent years. After a moment of consideration, Samuel opened the door. "Come in," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. One by one, the travelers stepped into the cabin, shaking off the rain and mud. They thanked him quietly, respectful of his space, and began to settle in. The cabin was small, but Samuel quickly arranged the furniture, making room for as many as he could. Blankets were distributed, and a fire was stoked in the hearth to warm the damp bodies. The first night was quiet, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of rain against the roof. Samuel watched the travelers, noting how they shared what little they had, how they spoke softly so as not to disturb the cabin. Despite the sudden intrusion into his life, he felt a sense of calm. These people were not intruders, they were travelers, like him in some ways, seeking shelter and safety. And in that moment, Samuel realized that solitude was not always the answer. Sometimes connection, even brief, could be comforting. Over the next few days, Samuel and the Apache travelers began to settle into a routine. He shared his food and water, showing them the small vegetable garden and the traps he had set for rabbits. They, in turn, shared stories of their journey, tales of family, community, and survival. Samuel listened with fascination. The travelers spoke of lands he had never seen, of traditions he had never known. He had always thought he knew the forest, but he realized there were lessons to be learned from people as well as nature. Despite the initial awkwardness, a bond began to form. Samuel taught some of the younger travelers how to fish in the river, how to recognize edible plants, and how to keep the fire going through the night. In return, they showed him techniques for cooking over an open flame, shared songs from their culture, and even helped repair parts of his cabin that had begun to wear. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, became a place of learning and exchange, a crossroads of lives that had once seemed entirely separate. Samuel noticed a change within himself as well. The loneliness that had defined so much of his life began to ease. He found joy in shared laughter, in helping others, and in the simple act of seeing someone else feel safe and cared for. Nights that were once silent and reflective were now filled with conversation, stories, and the quiet comfort of companionship. He realized that even after many years of isolation, it was never too late to open one's heart to others. One evening, as the rain finally ceased and the clouds parted to reveal a sky full of stars, the travelers gathered around the fire outside. Samuel joined them, feeling the warmth not just from the flames but from the shared sense of community. The leader of the Apache group spoke, thanking Samuel for his generosity and kindness. He spoke of how rare it was to find someone willing to offer shelter without hesitation, someone who could see beyond the immediate inconvenience and understand the deeper value of helping others. Samuel listened quietly, humbled. He realized that while he had spent decades surviving alone, he had also been living with a kind of limited understanding of life. Survival was important, yes, but so was compassion, generosity, and connection. The travelers had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. That life, no matter how long it had been spent in solitude, could always offer new lessons, new joys, and new bonds. The days passed quickly after that. The travelers helped Samuel repair the cabin's roof, collected firewood, and even painted parts of the walls that had become weathered. In return, Samuel taught them the subtle ways of the forest, the best spots to find wild berries, how to track animals without disturbing them, and how to listen to the forest in ways that spoke volumes. Every interaction was a lesson, and every moment felt like a bridge between two worlds that had rarely crossed paths before. As the time came for the travelers to continue their journey, there was a sense of quiet sadness in the cabin. Samuel had grown attached to their presence, and they had grown attached to his kindness. The leader of the group promised that they would carry his lessons and his generosity with them, and they left him a small token of gratitude, a handcrafted ornament, simple yet meaningful, to remind him that even the smallest acts of kindness could have a lasting impact. Once the travelers had gone, Samuel returned to his usual routines, but everything felt different. The cabin was still his home and the forest still his companion, but the memory of the visitors lingered. He realized that life's richness came not just from solitude or survival, but from connection and shared experience. The silence of the forest no longer felt empty. It felt like a space where memories, lessons, and the echoes of human kindness could coexist. Samuel's life settled into a new rhythm. He continued his daily tasks, tending the garden, fishing in the river, and walking through the forest. But now, he often paused to remember the travelers, to reflect on their stories, and to smile at the thought of the brief but meaningful connection they had shared. He began to understand that the forest, while vast and solitary, could still hold room for others, even if only for a short while. He also noticed subtle changes in himself. He was more open, more willing to help others, and more attuned to the feelings of those around him. The solitude that had once defined him was no longer a wall but a foundation, a place from which he could reach out and share, without fear or hesitation. Samuel realized that life was a balance between being alone and being with others, between reflection and action, and he felt grateful for the chance to experience both. As the seasons continued to change, Samuel remained in his cabin, now with a heart a little fuller and a mind a little wiser. He never forgot the 15 Apache travelers who had come to his door on that stormy evening, nor the lessons they had brought with them. Their presence had reminded him that even after years of isolation, life could surprise him, teach him, and enrich him in ways he had never imagined. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees and the sun painted the sky in soft hues, Samuel would sometimes imagine the travelers continuing on their journey, carrying a piece of his kindness with them, and in those moments he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a feeling that he had finally discovered a truth he had been seeking for decades, that life, even in its solitude, is never truly empty when one opens the heart to others. Samuel's cabin remained as it had always been, small, weathered and simple, but now it was also a place of stories, of connection, and of memory. The forest, once a silent companion, had witnessed a small miracle. The meeting of lives, the sharing of warmth, and the reminder that kindness can bridge even the widest gaps between people. And so Samuel continued his life, no longer merely surviving but living fully, with the quiet joy that comes from knowing that one's heart, once closed, can always be opened again.